Andu tamitik ni wagu magantik. Andu tamitik ni wagu magantik. Mitarit tagaganitagan. Sabihin na, kichansin ninaw, epe mamait. Kagusisi ko estatisya pinigay tutay sinigan. Umagis kinomatwin, kahit sigatik. Kaya ko naman mitari, kawes, ninanas komit na o. Kahit siya tuskatemek, kagusisi kaganaw kaya. So I'm starting out by giving you the usual greeting that I learned when I was a child growing up. And those words were very important. Dotamitik niwagumagantik. Many times we well recognize the issue of niwagumagantik, in terms of relations. But now a few people still use Dotamitik, which is a formal form of Dotemak, and it is used in the oral tradition on oral speaking. I used to hear it, at the meetings and when there was a formal address by a main speaker, whether they were talking about trapping, fishing, hunting, or many of our issues. And because I live close to the border on Manitoba, right across from the paw, Upaskiak, we say. I used to hear the Manitoba radio on AR radio. It used to be called, of course, CFAR radio. And then also the PA radio, and that's where I used to hear the Cree broadcast when I was growing up. My community is Kaminstigomenaiguska. It is interesting in regards to Kaminstigomenaiguska. Many of the fur trade literature will refer to it as Spruce Island, as Pine Island. And as a matter of fact, many of our community members now translate Cumberland House as Pine Island, but it is not Pine Island. Minahik is spruce. Skatik is pine. And it is very important to recognize the difference. And I'm writing right now my Ph.D. on the land, and that's one of my first corrections on written history being changed and made straight by the oral history and oral tradition. I was raised in a situation where I was at a trap line, and they called it Kauchu Spiskasik. Oto Spi is the alder. It's a place of the alder. It's in the Cumberland Delta region. And I was very, very extremely lucky because I used to be on the trap line about 2 months a year, in March and also in April, and sometimes all the way into May. And so I learned the life of living off the land from a very early age. The first thing that I wanted to mention was Awasis. I looked at Don Robertson's session on Awasis. Usche. We say uche. But Awasis is a very important concept, and sometimes we gloss by it, as the children. But what does it really mean? But Washoe means something that shines, something that gives off light. It is very interesting from a philosophical view that we have external light sources like the sun, the stars, and the moon. And we have, in the European tradition, other light sources of deities. But in Cree, as we're growing up, the child is born with the light. It is looked at as a positive aspect rather than attaining something negative, that it is a positive thing. And many times when I read fur trade literature, and I look at all of them, Europeans were always amazed at how we treated our children. And it is a very important fact in history. And as I looked at the children, and I was growing up myself in Cumberland, with the history of colonization and racism being embedded in our schools, we had our school in Cumberland House. It was a public school. But the teachers that we had come from the residential school from Sturgeon Landing. And so we had that experience from a teaching perspective. The good thing is that we were taught in our community. So the same things that happened in a residential school could not happen when I was taught in my own community. The same things such as the curriculum and racism and stuff, it's the same thing. But the treatment on children is a lot more severe. Because I remember one time one of the grandmothers came and gave a good talking to one of the teachers for being a little excessive in their authority. So there was a bit of a balancing position when you were taught in your own community. So the idea of a wasis is that of the light, as I talk about it metaphorically, is that with you as teachers, you are bringing back the light. When you come in and share things, you are bringing back the light. As we move forward, this light which has been dimmed will start to shine a lot brighter. With you, it is starting to shine a lot brighter. And that is what we hope to achieve as as teachers. When we're talking about many of the programs, as I saw, you have an excellent program. I saw everything from languages, to science, technology, all of those things that are very important for us. But I wanted to reflect a little bit on the Cree language itself, on what it does with those things. At the same time, I wanted to pay due respect to the Dene speakers, to the Dakota speakers, the Assiniboine speakers, Anishinabe Muin speakers, the OJ Cree speakers. Because in all of those languages, they're very important as we move ahead. One of the chiefs this morning was talking about stories. So what are our Cree stories? I started to do an analysis, and I will reflect upon one example, but I started to do analysis on it some time ago, and I did a paper in 1997 at the history conference on the Cree concept of narrative. And very interestingly, what I found was this, that we had three major superstructures. That was in addition to the everyday news that you share, which we call witamatuin. And the most ancient form that everybody else has in the world, which we call animogemwin, which is gossip. So when you look at these words, well, what do these words mean? Achimwin, achimwin, atutamwin, and achanogain. Well, when I look at those words, and after I did an analysis and I looked at various types of stories we had, I looked at achimwin, and we had minachimwin, the good stories, machachimwin, the negative stories. And we had usamachimwin, you know, the big time stories. We had uyasachimwin, mamata wachimwin. So we had all kinds of stories. When I started doing an analysis on it, we had about 15 different forms. When I went to university, and I did a little bit of literature and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but when I looked at it, when they were looking at history and literature, they had about 4 basic forms, of one including tragedy and comedy, and we were doing Greek studies and all that type of thing. But in Cree, there's not 4 or 5 or 6. I found 15 different forms of achimwina. It was absolutely amazing that the idea of the various forms of storytelling, no wonder, I said to myself, that I used to watch my aunties laugh all day long on some of these things. And then when I talked to my grandfather and so on, we had, different types of stories. When you actually did the analysis, it was amazing. The other thing I did notice is that many of historians, and I looked at even the work that was done in Pagarawagan by Brightman. It was one of the better works on Cree narratives. It included the bottom one that I have on the list, Atsanogena, which are stories of legendary beings. And they talked about Achimwena. But all of the experts that I know in narrative history, also in sociological history and anthropological history, do not deal with Atutamwena. And when you look at one of the things that I've taught myself in Cree in terms of analysis was this. You sometimes shorten it into a verb form. And you say, chimana. So we say, chimana. And when you say chimana, for atuta, you don't say atuta ana. You say atuta anima. So there was a difference. And for you who are the Cree linguists of the crowd, one of them is an animate version, the first one, chimana, and atuta anima is the inanimate version. So it was very interesting. It was the aboutness of storytelling that when you look at Achimwena and also Achanogena, which are stories about living beings, the difference between living beings on Achimwena and Achanogena was that indeed Achanogena were special forms of living legendary beings called Achanoganak, like Wisage, Chak, Witigo, etc. They're called Achanoganak. And it was a very interesting point. So some of you are listening right now, whether you're in Dakota, or Nakota, or Lakota, or whether you are in the various different dialects of Anishinabe. It is, and also in Cree and Dene, do your narrative analysis. You will be absolutely amazed and excited. It is very, very strong, very, very powerful. One I will like to tell you is because I was coming to Manitoba, we always say, "Natapa tu teneganima." I will retell something that I learned. And in terms of the story of Achanogain, it was an old Achanogain story. You know, the third form about legendary beings. And what I say is it was a story of Keewatin, or Keewatin, as we say. Now, Keewatin, I used to teach school in James Bay. And in James Bay, they would say Keewatin rather than Keewatin. So that was new. I never knew that till I got there. I taught school there for 2 years. Some of them from the west side of James Bay said Keewatin. The one on the east side said Keewatin. If you ever heard those Kashtin sing, I don't know if some of you remember, Chinano rather than Kinano. Yeah. So Keewatin itself, it's a very simple word. Everybody knows it in Cree. We call it the north wind. And everybody knows Kiwe means go home. But the question is all the time, who went home? Why is it that we call Keewatin the going home wind? Who went home? If you use a European anthropocentric view where you look only at human beings, you will think, apetega gayasin no, we would say in Cree, the ancient people. Maybe Kayasi Chipoan, maybe the ancient Dene. Kayasi Aiskime, maybe, the ancient Inuit. Or maybe Kayasi Nehinuw, the ancient Cree. So those people who are thinking in terms of human beings might say, well, that's a pretty good analysis. But the analysis is wrong. The one who went home I first learned about in 1997, I was at a conference, and that's why these conferences are so important. Because we share things. And interestingly, I did not learn this from a Cree. Now, that was amazing. No. You notice that the Cree's like that? But anyways, when I looked at that, it was my Anishinabe brother who told me that. So I asked him. He was from Saskatchewan. And he was an elder at the university. Danny Musqua. So I asked Danny, I said, in his Achanogain story, he said it was actually the north wind was actually the glacier that went home. Kitimaskami went home. It was the glacier that went home. Now, if we know, many of you are archaeological buffs out there, will recognize that the glacier pushed everybody down, and then they come back. And that happened about, the furthest he went down, and it went down to the States, close to the Missouri River, the glacier did. It was about probably a mile high right here. So what the ancient story says about Keewatin was the fact that it pushed the people down south. Animals, some animals will stay in the cold, but most of the animals and birds go south. As a matter of fact, we always call the birds Nipinaisak, the summer beings. But Keewatin was down there. Then later on, I did some more research on this thing. He said that it was told in Lawrence as well. And I knew that when Keewatin District was formed, the person that did it was Mackay, who was in the legislature, and he was also, working on the treaties. He was with the Treaty Commissioner group. And they used Keewatin District to be in that direction, just on the west side of Churchill, that region. And there was a story that came in by James Satie. He was a Cree Anglican person who worked in the province of Manitoba and also came to Saskatchewan. So James Satie had this story. And what it is that the Achinogain says that there was a great battle because the north wind was gaining strength, meaning the formation of the glacier. It was gaining strength, and it was pushing everybody down. It was so strong and powerful. And then over time, there was too much pressure and suffering, so that people said, we need to push you back. So the south wind got together with the east wind, and then for a certain period of time, they started pushing the north wind back. So the south wind and the north wind were being pushed back. And finally they came to an agreement where they said, okay, enough fighting. And we had summer and winter. Back again. We had summer in the north, back again. So it was a very important story on our own history. So a long time ago, they used to say we were here 3,000 years. Then they said 6,000 years. Then the archaeologists argued and fought about it till it's 12,000 years. Most archaeologists now say 15 to 18,000 years. If you listen to the linguistic expert that does work in Northern Europe and also in North America, that person says 35,000 years that people were here. But people knew one thing. We knew it's way more than 12,000 years because, the glacier had to start traveling back 12,000 years ago. So we knew that the Cree storytellers knew that it was prior to that time that they knew when it come back, because how else would they know that it was going home? They had to know it was going home. They had to know it was going back north. So it is a great story. It also tackles a lot of those people saying that, hey, those indigenous people can only remember only 100 years or 200 years or whatever. It's thousands of years and 10,000s of years. The other straightforward thing is that you have a word like Inuit people. What does it mean? Inuit. Innu. And in Quebec, I also found something different over there. They said, I went down, they said, Illinois, with an L. First time I had heard it. I knew about the Innu and it knew, but I didn't know about Illinois till I taught school in James Bay. But I also learned another one over there. They said, they even dropped the N over there. They said, EU. That's on the east coast of James Bay. So it was very interesting when I was there, learning about this. I was glad, they were sharing this with me when I was teaching there, for 2 years. And one of the other things that when you're learning a language and you're learning to do your own analysis is this. Sometimes it's good to look at the nouns. You can find out from the nouns. Sometimes you could shift the word and make it into a verb to make you understand better. This particular one is on adjectives or characteristics. For example, if I say Indiak and I say e Indi, that somebody is like an Aboriginal person or an Indigenous person. If somebody is like an Indigenous person, it means that that person has the get up and go, that that person has a lot of action orientation to that person, and that person is self-determining. The idea of Innu, of being an Indigenous person, is to be a self-determining person. And that's a very important thing to learn, from your language. And you see that all the way, even I checked with the Delaware, they use Inni as well. Mi'kmaq, they use Inni as well. There's two groups of people on the Inni. Some Inni use Inni all the way through. Some people, like the Anishinabe, also use Api. Anishinabe, Api. It's like the Delaware, they use Lenape. And if you look at the Blackfoot, they say Nitsitapi. There's the Api group and the Inni group. When they migrated back up north, and they must have spread out like that. And some of you who are linguists or historians, you needed to trace that out. I'm doing my own right now as I do my history on the land. One other thing is that I learned about is that for a long time we've been talking about Indigenous knowledge, and it's a very important concept. But the word we use in Cree is kiskanitamwin. It's knowledge. Tagiskanitam kayagoy. And when I was growing up, I hardly ever heard anybody said kigiskanitan nauma. What people tended to say was ginistutan nauma. That was usually what they would ask you. Ginistutan nauma. And what that means is that, do you understand this? And if you look at the spelling of it, right in the middle of nisitutamwin is ituta. When you talk about understanding in philosophy, some of them is just contemplation, thinking, cognition, all of that. In Cree, if you look at nisitutamwin, right smack in the middle of the word is ituta. You gotta do something with what you know. You gotta do something with what you know. In other words, knowledge, knowing something is good, but a good understanding requires action. Putawas kawis taman. You have to move on stuff. On Nehinuw philosophy, Pimatsuwin is a big word. Pimatsuwin, life. Matsisuwin, where it's a self-determination of life. And if you look at the different words, key words that we use on action, Pimote, walk. Mpata, run. Miska, Mina, Pimuside. So it's very interesting, even on key concepts in Cree, which is tied into our central concept of lifehood and survival, that Pim is there. So the essence of life is action and interaction. Without action and interaction, and this is the essence of teaching. The essence of teaching is action and interaction. Obviously, you cannot leave out knowledge, but still, it's action and interaction. And when you start doing a little bit of analysis, and you'll see that in Anishinabe as well, and also in the other indigenous languages. If you look at the everyday storytelling that we do when we get up in the morning, we're sharing stories. We call it witamatuin. We're sharing information. When you share information with each other, we say witamatuin. And what the key item in there is the atu. These are the atu verbs. The interactivity is not out there in the sky. It's right there in the middle of the word. And if you look at wichiituin, I can say, niwichi isun, I help myself, which is iso. Niwichi isun. Wichi isuwak, they help themselves. But if I say, wichihituin, when we help each other out, it's the itu in the middle. It's very interesting on the language, on how it's structured. And it's also atu. This morning when we heard the chief mention he's be going to the funeral, of the aunt. When you go and do and be there, we call it situskatuin. You support each other. You're forever supporting each other. And it is a very important thing to do because one of the things I've learned on funerals and weddings, this is where you get the essence of storytelling in the community. You can get it here and there all over the place, but you will find a lot of the key stories right there at the weddings and the funerals. So I always go in and ask questions all over the place. You know what I'm in that situation, and it's a tremendous context because it's a support relationship context. And there's also witatuskemituin. So interactivity is a strong part of indigenous languages. When I looked at doing the analysis on teaching, when we do foundations of teaching in university, we will learn about European teacher developers and educational theorists. You will learn about Pestalozzi, you'll learn about Freud Bell, you will learn about even American ones like John Dewey. You will learn a whole host of philosophers, educational philosophers. But our people have left off with educational philosophy as well. The three major educational forms that we have are these ones. And there's a lot of sub-levels of each of these. There's not only one way of looking at each of these. So the first one that's very regular is kiskinomagain. And this is teacher-directed learning. When somebody who knows something teaches you, that's called kiskinomagain. It's like in a regular school like yourself, as a kiskinomageo, a teacher. That's teacher-directed learning. The other thing when I was growing up, we were always going out in the bush, and our parents were never there, and they allowed us to go out and do the hunting and the fishing and etc. But when we were out there, we were in a situation of kiskinoamaswan. We were teaching ourselves. Kiskinoamaswan is an important part. We put that in, although when I took Native history the first time I went to university, back in the 70s, early 70s, they were saying that the Europeans were individualistic and we were collective. While Europeans put a lot of emphasis on individuality, they also had collective forms. Cooperative learning, group learning, all of that type of stuff. But the idea of indigenous people as being only collective was wrong. We had individual. When you say, "Eni paistamaswan," I am standing on my own to do this thing. So it's an individual position. And sometimes, depending on the context, it can be looked upon extremely positively, sometimes questionably. But you are still standing up for yourself. And so when you look at kiskinoamaswan, that's what it means. You are teaching yourself. And when Don Robertson comes and watches me when I'm curled, with the Winnipeg crowd, every year I come down here. It's my event. So I go in there, and when I'm curling, I will sometimes go in my own rink and I teach myself. I watch all those great curlers from Manitoba. And I watch all the great stuff they do. Then I go back home and I say, this is how I'm going to do it next year. So you teach yourself, and you teach yourself on what you do. You learn techniques, etc. when you're there. The other thing about is this. What is missing from all of that was this latter one. And it's a name that we give our book that my wife and I wrote. She had done her Ph.D. and it is a best practices book on teachers. It's teachers sharing their experience. These are stories about real teachers sharing their experience. What I did was include Cree conceptual structures, these ones that you see in front of you, but some other ones that I represented. And I started getting the first base on trying to get a Cree concept, in many cases, a foundations book. One of you may look at my book and add on to it. Or you may have a completely brand new idea. But it's very important to start putting out the books. I was involved in politics for 17 years. When you're working, very difficult to do writing. I found that each time when I did my master's degree, I had to take time off work and actually go to school. See that, board members? I'm talking about sabbatical. The importance of sabbatical. That you concentrate quite a bit on the children you're working with and the connection to the community. You don't have time to do much writing. I really appreciate people who can do that, but very few people do. You have to take the time out and concentrate. Writing is a tough chore. So, on this book, we'll do a session at Centennial Room 4, later on, and we'll do activities, with it. But it is something that I wanted to share, and as I did that, I also had another idea, and I thought I would do something on land. So I'm doing something on the land right now. And that one is on how did we lose our land? How is it? How did it come to be? So I'll give you a little bit of an idea. Could I have everybody stand up? Could I have, when you're looking at the crowd, look at each other. This is all the land in Canada. You're looking at all the land in Canada. Now, everybody sit down. Except for this guy right in front of me, I'll get you to stand up. Please stand up. He looks like a strong guy. I want you to stand up on one foot. He stood up on one foot, this guy. Let's give him a hand. When you look at reservation lands in Canada, on all of, you can sit down now. You did a good job. All the reservation lands in Canada, it's 0.2% of all lands in Canada. Not even 1%. 2/10 of all the land in Canada are reservation lands. Isn't that absolutely something? I said that in a non-Aboriginal gathering last year with 600 teachers. And they were amazed that it was only 0.2%. So I'm doing a history of the dispossession of land. And I'm also doing a history of our land because you need to make yourself strong. What is our land concept with the new Supreme Court decisions on duty to consult and all of that? You can make a new development on it. Now I'll move into my closing commentary. I taught school in 1967 in Ireland, Ontario. Then I taught school in Moose Factory from 1969 to 71, Moose Factory, Ontario. So I'll tell a little story about Ireland on my teaching experience. It was my first year teaching experience. I was teaching for an Indian Affairs day school. And so I phoned them up a couple days before and I told them I'm coming into town 35 years later. So I got to Thunder Bay, and which is where I phoned them up, and I'm all excited because I was actually found somebody. They said they would meet with us, and sure enough, when we got over there, we had about 20 people there. It was interesting because one of the person who greeted us was my grade 2 student, Nancy Saguch. She was the chief of her First Nation. And she was full of confidence as I looked at her and met with the other people as well. It was a good get-together. And of course, my wife was with me, Linda, that's sitting over here. Linda, could you please stand? Now that I made that guy stand. She has in her wisdom, because I've been talking about the new curriculum in Ontario, teaching, comparing Anishinabe and Cree, and I was doing, the new science curriculum, and I was doing, the language experience approach to learning, all of those types of stuff. So my wife asked the students, well, what do you remember from him? They said, they looked at each other. Oh, they said, dancing. And my wife asked, was it the jig? And they said, no. What was it? They said, it was the twist. The twist on assorted moves. And I could just see the picture now, little Keith Goulet's dancing up a storm in Ireland. But it was interesting because what they remembered was action. Because we had a Christmas concert, they had to perform in front of their parents. They had to perform in front of the community. It was educational action that was tied to the people and the community. The self-determination aspect of Nehinuw, the people, the nation, was an important part of their thinking. And that's why they remembered not only the action, but the connection to the people. The other story, and this is my last story, was the story of Ernest Goosey's. I go and visit now, 35 years later. I was in Moose Factory for 2 years, and I played in all Ontario Indian hockey tournament. Although you couldn't tell that now, I used to play hockey, but I did play hockey in the All-Ontario Indian Hockey Tournament. But when I was there, I really enjoyed it because, they had the different Crees, that come into Moose Factory. So I taught there, and we had a great session with the students. And we had a meeting together, and it was great to see them. I had pictures taken. And I had brought some pictures along from the past when I was there, so I presented them those pictures, the same thing I did in our land. So when I was there, a phone call came when I was meeting with most of the students. And lo and behold, one of the students was phoning because they were unable to make it to the gathering. And that student said, "Could you please stop over?" He says, "I'm managing my store, and I have to be here at the store." And I was thinking back about Ernest Kusis. I was Ernest Kusis. And when I looked at him, when I used to teach him, you could tell the turmoil that he must have gotten through. When he was talking to me, he couldn't look at you in the face straightforward. In other words, that there was a lot of mental abuse that he took. Just about all his aspect of self-determination was taken. Not completely gone, but a lot of it taken. That's what I remembered of him. When I walk into the store, here is a guy that's walking straight as an arrow. He is in great condition. And he looked absolutely fantastic. He sticks out his arm and he says to me, "I wanted to let you know," he said, "that you were the person that made a difference in my life." He says, "You changed my life." When you look at the future on what you were doing in education, you have already, some of you have come across this experience. You will also come across this experience. We dream whether or not we can make a difference. Sometimes we have all kinds of excuses about colonization and racism, all kinds of things. But as the chief said earlier on, it's the self-determination. It's the action of the people. It's what we do that makes a difference. Each and every one of you can make a difference. And that's what that says. Hawa ko si. Kinanas ko mit na, oh.